Something I want us to talk through for a few moments. Last week, if you got the chance to be with us online, we began a series entitled Leading Through. And the whole basis of the series is looking at what do we do in the midst of crisis? What do we do in the midst of uncertainty? And how do we continue to lead through? You know, it's fascinating for many of us because we have people that we lead, don't we? For some of you, you are a parent, you're a boss, you're a colleague, you're a neighbor, you are the leader of the local HOA, and people are looking to you. People are looking to you for answers. They're looking to you for a way forward. They're looking to you to figure out how do we lead through this season. And the crazy thing is, and if I could be honest with you for a second, isn't it true that we don't have all the answers? If you're a leader, you're leading a team, and they're looking at you like, help, can you help me get the answers? And isn't it true that we don't have all the answers? It's also true that we don't always know what to do. And I'm just going to be blunt with this. Isn't it true that in many instances, we are just making it up as we go? I mean, we've never led through a pandemic before. We've never led through something of this magnitude before. And one of the problems is we don't have all the answers. We don't always know what to do. And many times we don't want people to know it, but for probably many of us as leaders, we tend to just be making things up as we go. You see, there's no reason for us to knock the reality that uncertainty is a real part of our life. And uncertainty is the most valuable part of why our world needs leaders. Uncertainty is a permanent part of life. Everywhere we turn, we find that there are uncertain measures, there's uncertain realities to life. In fact, I would even say this, that uncertainty is why the world needs leaders. Uncertainty is why the world needs you. Uncertainty is why your colleagues, your coworkers. Uncertainty is why the students that you teach, it's why the people that you lead, it's why your family needs you. And so in this series, we're going to be looking at three basic essentials to help you and to help me and to help us as we try to grapple with what does it look like to lead through the chaos. And if I could step back for a second, I really believe that these principles are valuable principles to help us not just lead the people that we're around through the chaos, but to lead those around us that are looking to you for insight, that are looking to you for how you lead, looking to you for how you respond in the midst of brokenness and uncertainty. We are going to be looking at three essentials. And you see, last week we talked about this idea of leadership. We said that leadership is a stewardship. Leadership's on loan. Leadership is something that we get the chance to take part in, but it's a responsibility. In fact, when it comes to leadership, we don't have people. We get the chance to lead people. It's not the idea that these are my people. It's the reality is I get the chance to lead people. You see, leadership is a stewardship, and not only is it a stewardship, but as we looked at last week, it's temporary. I mean, everything has an expiration date, right? At some point, you are no longer going to be the boss. At some point, your role at your current company is no longer going to be there. At some point, you might move out of the current neighborhood. And so the leadership you have in your neighborhood, or at some point, your kids are going to get up and move out of the house. And your role as a parent, it shifts. You see, leadership is a stewardship. It's temporary. And last but not least, what we also looked at is that we are accountable. That we're accountable for how we lead. We're accountable for what we do. We're accountable for what we do with the leadership that we have. So looking at that, I want us to dive into the first basic principle of what it looks like to lead. What it looks like to lead through these perilous times, if you will. And the first thing we're going to look at, there's basically two different contexts with which we have leadership. The first one is this. The first one is, every leader exercises authority on two different levels. The first level is this. It's positional leadership or positional authority. We all have this chance to lead within a position. Maybe your position is you are a coach, you're a teacher. Maybe your position is you're a police officer. Maybe your position is you're a medical professional. We have positions with which give us authority. That we can walk into a room and we can be the expert when we walk in the room because there's certain things, there's certain realities of the position we hold that we know what is best, that we know what's going on. But there's another side of authority. It's not positional authority. In fact, this is what I would deem as the most critical portion of authority, and it's moral authority. You see, positional authority, it comes and goes, but moral authority, it is the authority that goes beyond our positions that we have. Moral authority is basically the credibility that we gain when we do what we say we're going to do. It's the credibility that we gain, that we earn when our walk matches our talk. You see, moral authority, it equates influence. Moral authority is basically influence. And isn't it true that in many instances, there's an influence to be had, there's an opportunity that we have, especially in our culture today. There's an opportunity we have to leverage influence for the good of those around us. So what's the difference between the two? When you begin to look at moral authority versus positional authority, when you begin to look at the challenges that are there, you know, one of the things I found is when moral authority is there, there's a trust element that's there. Trust can be found. When you have moral authority, isn't it true that you are trustworthy? When you have moral authority, people look to you and they are grateful for the way you lead because they see that your walk matches your talk. And all of a sudden, they begin to realize that you're worthy of being trusted. You're worthy of carrying influence because what you say really matters. So as we process today, here's what I want us to think about. And here's kind of the bottom line, if you would, of where positional authority and moral authority land. Kind of the bottom line of what is positional authority. I want you to think about it from this perspective. And sorry, I'm skipping forward a couple of slides. If you could go to positional authority. Positional authority provides a person with influence within a specific context for a limited time. Positional authority provides a person with influence within a specific context. That specific context is where you work. Right? You're a supervisor, you're a boss, a police officer, a parent. You have this authority within a specific context and for a limited time. But moral authority looks more like this. It provides a person with influence in a variety of contexts for an indefinite period of time. Moral authority basically says that regardless of where you're at, regardless of your position, you can still be trusted. You can still carry influence beyond your position. And you've probably worked for bosses that had moral authority, and you loved it. And you've probably worked for bosses that just leveraged their positional authority, and you realize that they wouldn't do anything for you. There's a challenge there. So today, as we really unpack what moral authority looks like, I want us to dive into a story of an individual in the Old Testament. A story of an individual who exercised remarkable moral authority. His name is Nehemiah. Nehemiah is an individual that exuded moral authority on multiple levels. In fact, today we're going to look at Nehemiah. Nehemiah was actually an individual that he lived and he worked within the context of King Artaxerxes I in basically 444 BC or the 5th century BC. Now, to give you a little context on what's going on, and this will help frame the moral authority that we have, that Nehemiah carried. To give you a little context, Nehemiah was an exile who lived in Persia in the 5th century BC. And one of the things to know is that Nehemiah was a personal servant to King Artaxerxes. He had remarkable influence. He was trusted. And Israel was a vassal state for roughly about 250 years. First under the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then into the Persians. And 130 years before the incident that we're going to talk about today, Cyrus the Great, a great leader, he gave the Israelites the opportunity to go back home if they wished, to go back to their homeland, to go back to Judah, to go back to Jerusalem. And many of them chose to go back, and some chose to stay put. They chose to stay where things were comfortable in many instances. But those that chose to go back to their homeland, they found some interesting things. They found that their homeland was ravaged. In fact, the walls around Jerusalem, they'd been torn down. The walls around Jerusalem had been torn down over 100 years ago when Nebuchadnezzar invaded the city, and they'd never been rebuilt. And so many of the surrounding communities, trying to ensure that Israel would never become a superpower, they would go in and they would leverage their authority. They would go in and they would take money from the Israelites. So they would go in and they would loan money to the Israelites. And what they would do is while they were loaning the money, they would hold a very high collateral and very high interest rates. They wanted to do everything they could to ensure that the Israelites had no authority, had no power. And so in many instances, they would hold collateral as land, as property. In many instances, they would hold collateral as family members, kids, wives. To think about what the Israelites were what was going on, it wasn't just that the walls were down. And yes, the walls being built was something that gave Nehemiah remarkable credibility. But Nehemiah heard that his people, that the people that he loved, that they were going through just ridiculous times. And so he prays for an opportunity. He prays for an opportunity. And here's what he finds, that his heart was moved towards the people of Israel. His heart was moved towards his people. And so he concocted a plan, and he goes to King Artaxerxes. He goes to his boss. He says, hey, here's what I want you to do. I want to go back to my homeland, and I want to help them rebuild and gain security. And King Artaxerxes, he didn't balk at it. In fact, he said, why don't you go? In fact, let me help you. Let me fund you. In fact, because the Israelites are part of our people, because we've got dominion over the Israelites today, I'm going to name you the governor of Judah. You have all authority when you go there. So Nehemiah, he took his assistants, he took his people, he took his resources, and he went to Jerusalem to restore the kingdom, to restore the city, to restore his people group. And one of the things he found quickly was that the walls needed to be rebuilt, but that wasn't the only thing. You see, in building the walls, Nehemiah gained remarkable moral authority. He gained credibility because it wasn't just him sitting back telling people what to do, but he was rolling up his sleeves. He was doing everything he can to fight for and to build the walls with them. But there's something that was going on that really got Nehemiah's attention. He began to realize what was going on the outside. He began to realize that there were people on the outside that were holding loans and were taking captive and taking Israelites as bond servants because of these loans that they had cut. So Nehemiah found it within his own personal recollection, his own money, to go and to free these Israelites. So he went to the local areas and he began to pay so that he could get the Israelites back out of freedom, so that he could have all of his people together and they could locally begin to build the walls and restore the city and get things back the way it was. But after several years, Nehemiah realized something. He realized that what was going on outside the city was actually going on inside the city as well. That what was going on outside the city, where people were going inside and making loans, that some of the Israelites were in the city and they were doing the very same thing. They were giving high interest loans to their own people and then taking their collateral, taking their people, taking their lands, and they were doing the exact thing that Nehemiah had just fought so hard to free. And it got Nehemiah a little upset, as you could probably imagine. It got Nehemiah a little bit frustrated, and Nehemiah documents what goes on next. In fact, in the Old Testament, or the Jewish scriptures, we Christians call it the Old Testament, but you find a book called Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is basically a journal. It's a diary of sorts of Nehemiah documenting his leadership struggles and challenges and joys. In fact, in Nehemiah chapter 5, he writes this. He says, when I heard their outcry and these charges, when I heard everything that was going on, I was angry. That's an understatement, right? And so it says that, and I pondered, he goes on and he says, then I pondered them in my mind, and then I accused the nobles and the officials. I told them, you are charging your own people interest. Come on, people. What, you're charging your own people interest. Do you understand what's going on? And Nehemiah continues, and he goes on and he says, so I called together a large meeting to deal with them, and this is what I said. As far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews. And I think he's being nice here. He's saying we to collectively bring everybody in, but he's basically saying, I did it. Quit being idiots. But he goes on, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. And now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us. Come on, people. Now you are selling your own people. You're holding captive your own people. And he goes on and he says, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Oops, I think I just read that verse. And he continues. And he's asking the people, what do you think happened? Hey, we did everything we could to bring people back. What do you think happened? How do you think they responded to this? Well, they kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. They got called on the carpet. They realized that what they were doing was not okay. So Nehemiah continues. It says, so I, me Nehemiah, he continues, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? In other words, our neighbors are laughing at us. The very thing that the rules that you're trying to put in place, you are undermining your own economy. You're doing the very things that you don't want the people on the other side of the walls to do. And as if Nehemiah he's not finished. He's like, hey, okay, hold up. I'm not finished with this. Come at me. He said, I and my brother, he said, I and my brothers and men are also lending the people money and grain. But let us stop charging interest. In other words, I know that there's some times where you need to help your neighbors out. I know there's times where you need to lend money and you need to lend some of your resources, and that's okay. In fact, according to the Torah, these great Israelites, these great Jewish individuals, they realized that the Torah allowed for them to lend their money and their resources to their own people group. But what it did not allow for is for them to charge interest, for them to take advantage, for them to take advantage of their own people in an effort to belittle and gain power and influence. And it didn't work. In fact, these wealthy Jews, they basically responded this, and it's kind of interesting. They said, he goes, give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive gardens with great breadsticks, and houses, and also the interest that you were charging them. Nehemiah continues, says, I want you to give everything back. To which probably many of you would, if you were in that room, you're rolling your eyes thinking there's no way they're going to give it back. But listen to what it says. He goes, they responded and they said, we will give it back. And we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. But, Nehemiah has seen their track record. He wasn't a fool. So he responds and he says this. He says, then I summoned the priest. I said, come on in, priest, and made the nobles and officials take an oath. Basically, he said, I want you to take an oath that you are going to do exactly as you promised. And then he continues on and he says this, I also shook out the folds of my robe and I said this, in this way may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. And here's what they did. And the people did as they had promised. Which some of us are probably thinking, well, that's a cute Bible story. Obviously it works because it's in the Bible. But, the thing that's fascinating is this, is that Nehemiah, he was able to lead with remarkable influence, with moral authority. And the reason was, in fact, the reason Nehemiah's words held such credibility is because, in fact, he documents. In fact, listen to what he continues to say. talks about what's going on. And he says, moreover, he begins to talk about this. Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, you've seen me from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes when I was appointed to be the governor in the land of Judah 12 years ago. You know how I know this? Look at the next verse. Until his 32nd year, 12 years. It's kind of cool. You should read the Bible. It's incredible the detail that it has in there. Nehemiah is saying, for 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. You see, the governor at the time, he had the right to take the money from, to take the food from, to take the grain. He had the right to take everything that was there as the governor. I mean, he had that authority. But he chose not to make any money off of his own people. But he continues, he talks about earlier governors. The earlier governors, those who preceded me, they placed a heavy burden on the people. And they took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to food and wine. And he goes on, it wasn't just the governors, it was their assistants that also lorded it over the people as well. Previous governors had abused this reality. They had taken this simple idea as governor, as powerful, and they began to exploit their people. And the wealthy citizens of the town, of the area, they did exactly as the governor would do. They would follow suit, essentially. But Nehemiah says, out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work of this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work, and we did not acquire any land. Just like food and wine and grain. As a governor, he was entitled to land. In fact, land was a place of great prominence. If you had land, you had power. And he didn't do that. He did what he came to do. He did not demand anything that he wasn't going to hold of himself. And in fact, he says, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor because the demands were heavy on these people. He understood for 12 years. They were walking with him and they saw that his words matched his talk, or his words matched his life. They saw that the life he lived carried great credibility. The life he lived allowed the decisions he made to be carried with great trust. The life he lived, it almost shamed the nobles into submission. You see, that's good leadership. That's the kind of leader that you and I, that's the kind of leader that we want to follow. That's the kind of leader that we desire to be. And the truth is, it goes back to moral authority. And if we were going to define moral authority, we would make moral authority out to, it's a tricky thing, isn't it? I mean, when it comes to moral authority, it's one of those realities that it takes a lifetime to gain. I mean, you work really hard, you do everything you can to be trustworthy, to gain influence, and one unguarded moment, what happens? All of a sudden, your trust, your influence goes out the wayside. One unguarded decision, one unfortunate say, one unfortunate blunder, and next thing you know, our moral authority is in question. But when it comes to moral authority is essentially this. It is an essential during times of disruption and uncertainty. Moral authority is an essential during times of disruption. I mean, you are looking for people today who they carry their moral authority, because when we're looking for answers, when we're looking to see what to do, when we're looking for certainty in the midst of uncertainty, we want to look to people whose walk matches their talk. It's an essential during times of disruption and uncertainty. And the truth is, trust is earned. Trust is earned. But trust is not just earned. Trust is influence. I mean, for many of us, you've probably seen how your parents, maybe you trusted them or maybe there was a lack of trust, but it didn't have to do with what they demanded of you as much as it had to do with what they demanded of themselves. That when we see people that we trust, oftentimes we see them holding themselves up to a higher pedestal. We see them walking the talk. We see them doing what's expected of them and no questions asked. You see, trust is earned and trust is influence. And isn't it true that your respect for someone who, or lack their respect, of someone who required things of themselves, ultimately, when you see them carrying it out, it is a valuable thing. So, just to kind of help you think about this, our lives speak louder than our words. Our lives speak louder than our words. The way we live in our culture today speaks louder than the words that we proclaim. The way we live in our culture today speaks louder than the words we share on social media. The way we live in our culture today speaks volumes. So with that in mind, I want to wrap the message up today with 3 simple gauges. 3 gauges to help us monitor our moral authority. 3 gauges to help us figure out where we're at in this moral authority. And the first gauge that's going to help us protect our influence is we need to pay attention to your response to authority. We need to pay attention to your response to authority. Now, if I could be a little bit candor in this, the way we respond to those in leadership of our city, of our nation, of our state, people are watching. Your kids are watching. Your neighbors are watching the way you respond, the way you act. The people around you, they see the way you respond to authority, and in many instances, they will be shadows of you. Or in 10 years, they're going to be reminded of the way you responded to authority. And for many of us, we've lost moral authority because the way we've responded to many of the authority figures in our life. We've lost moral authority with some people because when things didn't go our way, we decided to be a little bit of a rear end, right? From time to time. I have that capability as well. But isn't it true when it comes to our response to authority? If we are too important to be under, you're probably too immature to be over. If we're too important to answer to authority, then we're probably too immature to be over people. So we need to pay attention to the response to authority. And the second thing to keep an eye on, the second gauge, is your sense of entitlement. Nehemiah had every right to be entitled. He had every right to say, I deserve, this is mine. But isn't it true that when we begin to think about the entitlement that we have, when we begin to think about the list of excuses that we make to justify a behavior, to justify why we deserve one thing over another, isn't it true that when we begin to look at the list of excuses, we begin to realize, you know what? Maybe I'm acting a little bit more entitled than I think I should. You know, one of the gauges that I've been thinking about on this front is when I'm tempted to do something that I am trying to figure out, is this something wise? One of the things I begin to think about is I think about some of the mentors, some of the pastors that I'm learning from and leading into for great clarity. And I begin to ask myself, would they do this? I mean, even just as simple as this, I've gotten kind of addicted to Phase 10 on my phone. I love that game. It's remarkable. Like, I'm winning like crazy. And anyway. But I begin to ask myself, is this a game that some of these leaders are playing with every waking moment of their life? And it begins to put track. We begin to ask questions. Do people we respect, are they making the same list of excuses? You see, entitlement is such a slippery slope. It is a slippery slope because maybe we do deserve the very thing we're trying to fight for. But whatever it is, there's probably going to be a time in your future where you're going to say, you know what, I got it. But the influence I lost might not have been worth it. So the gauges to think about is your response to authority, your sense of entitlement. And the last thing to think about, the last gauge is this, your imaginary conversations. I mean, think about it. It's beautiful. Bluetooth allows everybody to have imaginary conversations, and you don't even have to be imaginary anymore. You can talk out loud because everybody's doing it. They just have their earpiece in, right? And they're talking through them all, and you're like, "How are you? What's going on?" but paying attention to the imaginary conversations that are going within us. There's many times that we have conversations inside of us that we're like, that should stay inside, but sometimes it comes outside and we're like, oh, that was not supposed to happen. When we mess up, I want to encourage you to fess up. Just because we mess up does not necessarily mean that you've lost moral authority, but isn't it true that we trust leaders who mess up? But oftentimes we are very quick to put a short rope on the trust of the leaders that are always making excuses. When you mess up, fess up. Do it quickly. But pay attention to the imaginary conversations, the justifications that you make in your mind, the justifications that you make in your heart. So, as we've talked about, moral authority. Moral authority is basically this idea that our walk and our talk match. Moral authority is this idea that we get the chance by our actions to carry great influence. And I just think that today, that in our culture today, our moral authority is more important than anything we could carry. And as followers of Jesus, I want you to know that the world is looking at you. They're watching you to see if following Jesus is worth it. And so allowing our walk and our talk to match is so critical. So as we said, moral authority is basically this. It is an essential during times of disruption and uncertainty. You can be a leader and not have moral authority, but very few leaders are worth following that sacrifice moral authority. And you can have positional authority without moral authority, but isn't it true that moral authority it carries beyond your life? Remember, we talked about this last week, that your final chapter is what you are known for. People are usually defined by their final chapter and not necessarily their finest chapter. They're remembered for how they lived. It's the moral authority that's talked about at funerals. It's the moral authority that's shared in the midst of that. So think about that. Let these gauges be a gauge for you. And as we close, I just want to share one prayer that would be such a valuable thing for you and a valuable thing for me to think about when it comes to moral authority. And the prayer is this: Heavenly Father, give me the wisdom to know what's right and the courage to do what's right, even when it costs me. Heavenly Father, give me the wisdom to know what's right and give me the courage to do what's right, even when it costs me. God, we thank you so much for the fact that you are a big God. And God, we live in a time where moral authority is so valuable. God, we live in a time where God, there's great uncertainty, great unrest, great struggles, great challenges. God, everywhere we turn, it seems as though people are waiting for us to fall. Everywhere we turn, it's as if there is an opinion that is waiting to undermine everything we believe in. But God, I'm so grateful for Nehemiah and his courage to do what is right. And I'm grateful for the way he led and the way he championed his people. And God, I pray that we would be known, Father, not for the positional authority that we hold in many instances, but that we would lean past our positional authority and that we would begin to lean into our moral authority. God, give us the wisdom to know what is right and give us the courage to do, even when it costs us. God, we thank you and we love you. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.